Now, the rest of the story. In 1775, a high-ranking officer of the Continental Army, despite heavy casualties among his troops, almost conquered Canada. The following year, commanding an inferior fleet, that same military genius battled the British to a draw on Lake Champlain. And the year after that, at Saratoga, that same Revolutionary War hero, through sheer strategic brilliance, forced a stunning surrender of the Redcoat forces. Without the contribution of that extraordinary soldier in the first 3 years of the war, says respected historian George Newman, probably we would have lost the Revolution. The soldier's name, his Abnaki Indian name, was Dark Eagle. And now you're going to hear the rest of the story. Dark Eagle had none of the white man's formal military training, but he was a natural warrior. And so precocious was he in the art of combat, quite early in his career as a colonial officer, George Washington emoted the merit of this gentleman is certainly great and promptly offered him his own regiment. As news of his remarkable victories reached the home front, patriots competed to produce adequate superlatives. Many compared Dark Eagle to history's greatest military heroes. In a letter to Samuel Adams, James Warren called him a genius of the battlefield, without equal in modern times, likened his accomplishments to Hannibal's. Engagement after engagement, Dark Eagle displayed his native cunning by avoiding traps laid by the most seasoned British generals, and yet when facing his foe head-on, he personally demonstrated such reckless bravery that troops on both sides thought him a madman. At Saratoga, he galloped full speed into the enemy's midst, with his astonishing brigade barely able to keep up. Both he and his horse were shot, the latter fatally. And yet even then, as he lay pinned beneath his fallen steed, his leg crushed, muskets blazing all around him, Dark Eagle continued issuing orders to his men. As the war wore on, Dark Eagle grew disillusioned. Love of the ideals for which the colonists fought and the hope that his sons would one day remember his name with pride had driven him through 3 desperate years of battle, but frustration with Congress, which had chronically underestimated him and under-provisioned his troops, and our alliance with France, of which he had always disapproved, embittered him, until, in a manner of speaking, Dark Eagle switched tribes. For once upon a revolution, there was an untrained soldier, a mere volunteer who rose to the rank of general on merit alone, a warrior without whom our freedom might never have been won, and yet whose name was destined for dishonor. Because, you see, Dark Eagle was the name given to him by the Abnaki Indian Natanes, who accompanied him on his valiant march to Quebec. But Dark Eagle had an even darker name, one with which he was born, and which, before he died, became synonymous with traitor. For you remember the military genius whom many believed was the finest general in the Continental Army. You remember him as a stone-cold sellout named Benedict Arnold. Only you now know the rest of the story.
And now, the rest of the story. Benedict Arnold, the one most commonly called the traitor of the American Revolution, was born in January 1741 in Connecticut, British America. He was the 6th of his family to be named after his great-grandfather, Benedict Arnold I. Benedict I was the first governor of the colony of Rhode Island. Benedict Arnold II served as deputy to the Colonial Assembly from Newport for 8 terms and served as governor's assistant 3 times. Then there was Benedict Arnold III, whom I found very little information about other than his family ties. Benedict Arnold IV was a merchant. He eventually became a tax collector and a captain of the local militia. Benedict Arnold V was born in 1738 but died a year later. In 1741, Benedict Arnold IV had another son whom he named Benedict Arnold. This is the Benedict Arnold that we all know. In 1754, the colonists were embroiled in war with the French and their Indian allies in what has become known as the French and Indian War. In 1757, 16-year-old Benedict joined the Connecticut militia. The militia began marching to help the colonist soldiers at Fort William Henry in northeast New York. On the way, they learned that the fort had fallen to the enemy and many of the survivors had been murdered after their surrender. The militia had no choice but to return home. Benedict Arnold served for just 13 days in the French and Indian War. In 1759, Benedict's mother died, followed 2 years later by his father. The 1760s were prosperous for Benedict. He became a wealthy merchant. He and his business partner bought ships and established a successful West Indies trading company. To recoup money from the expense of that French and Indian War, the British government passed the Sugar Act of 1764 and the Stamp Act of 1765. The Sugar Act added a high tax to the sale of, sugar. The Stamp Act was a tax put on printed materials in the colonies, which included any sort of paper, even playing cards. If you paid the tax, it was stamped with a seal showing the tax had been paid, hence it was called the Stamp Act. Now these acts caused an economic depression. Many colonial merchants, including Benedict Arnold, defied these acts and became smugglers. Benedict Arnold joined the Sons of Liberty, whose purpose was to fight against taxation and to fight for the rights of the colonists. In February 1767, Benedict married Margaret Mansfield, daughter of the sheriff of New Haven, Connecticut. In the following year, they had their first child, a son. Guess what they named him? Benedict Arnold. No surprise there. The strain put on the colonists by Parliament led to the Declaration of Independence and war. In March 1775, Benedict was elected captain of the Connecticut militia. 2 months later, he was promoted to colonel. But Benedict was a man of action. He hated waiting around for the fight to come to him. He heard that Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York was poorly defended. He marched his men to the fort where they joined up with Ethan Allen's men. They quickly seized Fort Ticonderoga. Following this success, Benedict got into a dispute over control of the fort and resigned. But Benedict's success had earned him the nickname the hero of Fort Ticonderoga, and George Washington took notice of him. But on his way home, he learned that his wife had died. Now, after he returned home, Benedict urged the Second Continental Congress to authorize the invasion of Quebec, which they agreed to. Now, Benedict expected to command the invasion force, but he was passed over. Benedict was stunned and irritated. He met up with George Washington and urged a second attack on Quebec, by which his men would pass through the wilderness of Maine. George Washington commissioned him as a colonel in, not the militia, but the Continental Army. 1,100 men left with Benedict in that September 1775, but the passage was difficult. About 300 men deserted during the march and 200 died en route of disease. Finally, Benedict's men arrived 2 months later. On New Year's Eve, 1775, Benedict's men, joined by Richard Montgomery's small army, attacked Quebec City. Montgomery was killed in the battle and Benedict's left leg was injured. Benedict was promoted to brigadier general for reaching Quebec and for his siege on the city. This famous portrait of Benedict shows him in the wilderness above Quebec City. Benedict may not have won every fight he entered, but his tactics slowed British advancements and saved the lives of many of his men as well as their armaments. When his men were forced to retreat from Montreal by an advancing British army, he, Benedict, was the very last soldier to leave before the British arrived. Benedict was a strong-willed person who often argued with his commanders. Now, he may have become friends with George Washington, but he'd made many enemies along the way. including John Brown, a lower-level officer with political connections. He despised Benedict to such an extent that he published a handbill against Benedict. "Money is this man's god," he wrote, "and to get enough of it, he would sacrifice his country." It's almost as if John Brown could see the future. In 1777, Benedict tried to resign after being passed up for another promotion to Major General, but George Washington refused to allow him to resign. He was just too important. At the insistence of George Washington, he was eventually promoted to Major General, but he did not receive the same seniority as if he had been promoted earlier. And he thought he should have been promoted earlier. Now, this may sound trivial to us, but the senior officer on the field made all of the decisions during battle. In July of 1777, Benedict and 900 men relieved other soldiers at the siege of Fort Stanwix in New York. Now, rather than waiting around for the British with their Indian allies to run out of supplies, Benedict sent an Indian messenger into the fort with news that a huge force of colonial soldiers would soon arrive at the fort ready for battle. The Indian allies fled, and the British gave up the fort without a fight. In September and October 1777, Benedict fought in the battles of Saratoga, but he often argued with Major General Horatio Gates. Remember that seniority I mentioned earlier? Well, after that first battle, Benedict and Gates got into such a heated shouting match that General Gates removed Benedict's field command. Thankfully, Benedict paid no attention to that order and continued to fight. Benedict led charge after charge and kept the colonists fighting. In one of the final volleys of the battle, Benedict was shot in his leg. Then Benedict's horse was shot and killed. As the horse fell, it landed on Benedict's already wounded leg and shattered it. But shortly after being wounded, the British soldiers were forced to retreat. It was the victory that many scholars have said turned the tide in the American Revolution. Normally, a battlefield doctor would have amputated Benedict's shattered leg, but Benedict ordered that doctor to save his leg at all costs, which he did. For the rest of his life, Benedict's left leg was 2 inches shorter than his right, and he walked with a limp and often had to walk with a crutch. This should have ended his military career. Benedict became famous in the colonies as the hero of Fort Ticonderoga in Saratoga. Now, if he would have just stopped right there, Benedict Arnold would be revered in American history. There could have even been a day set aside in his memory, a national holiday, Benedict Arnold Day. But Benedict would not stop. After months of recovery, he returned to the army at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania in May of 1778. When Benedict arrived, he was surprised when soldiers who had fought at Saratoga stopped what they were doing and applauded. In that same month, he did something so ordinary that if it hadn't been for his later actions, I wouldn't even bother to mention it. On May 30th, 1778, Benedict Arnold pledged an oath of allegiance to the United States. This fill-in form said, "I, Benedict Arnold, Major General, do acknowledge the United States of America to be free, independent, and sovereign states, and declare that the people thereof owe no allegiance or obedience to George III, King of Great Britain, and I renounce, refuse, and abjure any allegiance or obedience to him. And I do swear," now notice here that in swearing allegiance, the soldiers had to physically write "swear" in that space provided. "And I do swear that I will, to the utmost of my power, support, maintain, and defend the said United States against the said King George III, his heirs and successors, and his and their abettors, assistants, and adherents, and will serve the said United States in the office of Major General, which I now hold, with fidelity, according to the best of my skill and understanding." In the following month, George Washington appointed Benedict military commander of the city of Philadelphia. This marked the beginning of his downfall. You see, it was there that he met and fell in love with Margaret, they called her Peggy, Shippen, the daughter of a loyalist judge who had supported the British while they occupied the city. During the British occupation, Peggy courted a soldier who would have a lasting impact on Benedict's life, Major John Andre. In 1779, Benedict married Peggy, and his life's course took a whole different direction. But we can't put all the blame on Peggy. Benedict was certainly bitter towards Congress and seemingly every other colonist with the exception of George Washington. But Peggy had all of the connections that enabled Benedict to betray the United States. Benedict began exchanging secret letters with the British in which he offered his services in exchange for £10,000. That would be about $2.2 million in today's money. After a year of secret letters, some of which were written in code and others in invisible ink, Benedict began selling his property in America and transferred his assets to London. In June 1780, Benedict sent a detailed secret letter which described the conditions at West Point, which the British hoped to capture because of its strategic position on the Hudson River. In August 1780, Benedict finagled command of West Point. Finally, on August the 30th, Benedict and British Lieutenant General Henry Clinton came to an agreement with Peggy's help. On September 21st, Benedict met John Andre at the Joshua Head Smith House, now known as the Treason House, on the Hudson River. John Andre had arrived on the HMS Vulture. Early on the following morning, 2 colonial soldiers saw the ship in the Hudson and fired at it. The Vulture retreated and left John Andre no choice but to return to New York overland. Benedict wrote passes for John Andre so he would be able to pass through the lines, and also gave him the plans for West Point. On the following day, September 23rd, John Andre was captured by 3 militiamen who found the plans for West Point. Uh-oh. On September the 24th, Benedict was waiting for George Washington. They were supposed to have breakfast together at Washington's headquarters. While waiting, Benedict's aide brought a letter which told of Andre's capture. It told that they found the West Point plans, and news of the capture and treasonous plot was sent to George Washington. Benedict knew he was in deep trouble. He made his excuses, left Washington's headquarters, and had a boat take him to the HMS Vulture. He fled to New York. He left a letter for George Washington in which he asked that Peggy receive safe passage back to her family in Philadelphia, which Washington granted. On October 2nd, 1780, John Andre was hung as a spy. George Washington made several attempts to capture Benedict, but all were unsuccessful. British General Clinton refused Benedict's request to go to England until General Cornwallis's surrender. On December the 8th, 1781, Benedict and his family left New York for England. All attempts by Benedict to get a position within the British government failed. The British press criticized him for his actions, which caused the hanging death of John Andre, who was celebrated for his patriotism. Benedict was never paid that promised £10,000. In 1785, Benedict and his family moved to Canada and began a shipping company. 6 years later, they returned to London. On June the 14th, 1801, 60-year-old Benedict Arnold died after a long illness. He was buried without military honors in a crypt below St. Mary's of Battersea, a stone church overlooking the Thames River. Today, the crypt is painted white, the floor is carpeted, and the tomb is located in St. Mary's kindergarten classroom. A plaque marking the spot was placed in 2004 by an American who thought his accomplishments before his betrayal had been overlooked. Beside this plaque, which adorns his grave, is the kindergarten class's goldfish tank. Upstairs in the church's sanctuary is an ornate stained glass window dedicated to Benedict. This window, donated by an American during the 1976 American Bicentennial, is decorated with British Union Jacks and the American Stars and Stripes, crisscrossed in friendship. The name Benedict Arnold is forever synonymous with traitor. But it's easy for us, with the advantage of hindsight, to say that Benedict Arnold should not have betrayed the colonists. But at the time, victory for the United States was not a sure thing. A lot of people still expected the British to win. The British military was said to be the best in the world at the time. If Benedict Arnold's plan had succeeded, it's likely that the British would have won the war. In that case, rather than calling him a traitor, we Britons, we would probably still be British subjects, we would celebrate Benedict Arnold as a hero. George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and all of the other founding fathers, they would have been the ones regarded as traitors. Can you imagine that? I'm Brad Dison. Thanks for watching, and now you know the rest of the story.